The Mormon Church has long faced questions about its history and its origins, particularly when it comes to polygamy and race.
I wish to state categorically that this church has nothing whatever to do with those practicing polygamy.
For nearly 200 years, the Mormon Church has been one of the most successful religious movements in modern history. What began as a small group founded by a young man named Joseph Smith grew into a global religion with millions of members, thousands of missionaries, and temples spread across continents. From the outside, it looked unstoppable. But for some former members, the story changed with a single discovery: a document, a journal entry, a piece of church history they say they were never taught. Many describe the experience the same way. First came confusion, then questions, then a search for answers. And for some, that search led them out of the church entirely. Today, a growing number of former members claim the Mormon Church is facing something few people can see. Not a public scandal, not a sudden collapse, but a quiet crisis unfolding behind the scenes. They point to historical controversies, changing generations, declining activity in some regions, and an internet age where information once buried in archives is now only seconds away. Yet, church leaders continue to announce new temples, expand globally, and report millions of members worldwide. So what is really happening? Is one of the world's most influential religions experiencing a silent collapse? Or is this simply the latest challenge in a history filled with controversy? To answer that question, we have to go back to where the story began. And what we found raises even more questions than answers. The story begins in the early 1800s. At the time, America was going through a period of intense religious excitement. New churches were appearing, preachers traveled from town to town, people debated faith everywhere they went. In the middle of this movement was a young man named Joseph Smith. According to Smith, he wanted to know which church was true. He later claimed that God and Jesus Christ appeared to him and told him that none of the existing churches had the full truth. Years later, Smith said an angel named Moroni visited him and revealed the location of buried golden plates. Those plates, he claimed, contain the history of ancient people who had once lived in the Americas. Smith later published what became known as the Book of Mormon. To believers, it was a new volume of scripture. To critics, it raised questions that continue to be debated nearly 2 centuries later. But in the 1830s, the movement grew quickly. Followers joined despite intense opposition. Some were driven from their homes. Others traveled hundreds of miles to stay with the growing church. After Joseph Smith was killed in 1844, leadership passed to Brigham Young. Under his direction, thousands of followers made a difficult journey west and eventually settled in what is now Utah. There, the church began building something remarkable: a new religious society, a strong community, and eventually a global institution. But as the church grew, so did the questions surrounding its founder. Questions that would remain buried for generations, and those questions would become impossible to ignore in the years ahead. For most of the church's history, information traveled slowly. Members learned church history from lessons, books, leaders, and official publications. But the internet changed that. Suddenly, old newspapers, journals, letters, and historical records became available to anyone with a phone or computer. Former members often describe this as a turning point. Many say they began researching church history after encountering a question they couldn't answer. Others stumbled across discussions online. Some found historical documents they had never seen before. For the first time, members could compare traditional church narratives with original records from the past. At the same time, Podcasts, forums, videos, and online communities created spaces where people could share experiences openly. Questions that once stayed private became public. Stories that once remained local spread globally. Church leaders also responded. Over time, the church published essays addressing difficult topics from its history. Supporters viewed this as a sign of transparency. Critics argued the information should have been discussed much earlier. Either way, the conversation had changed, and for some members, the discoveries were only beginning. Because one of the biggest debates centered on events that happened at the very beginning of the church itself, and what they found would challenge assumptions held for generations. Among the most discussed topics are the accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision. Members are often taught that Smith saw God and Jesus Christ in a sacred experience that launched the Restoration. But historians later highlighted that multiple accounts of the event exist. The accounts share important similarities, yet they also contain differences in wording, emphasis, and detail. Critics argue these differences raise difficult questions. Church scholars respond that people often describe major life events differently over time without changing the core experience. Another debate involves the translation of the Book of Mormon. Many members grew up seeing artwork showing Joseph Smith translating directly from golden plates. Historical records describe a more complex process. These records mention the use of seer stones. The church today openly acknowledges this history. For some members, learning these details was surprising, not necessarily because the information existed, but because they say they never encountered it earlier. Supporters argue these details strengthen the historical record. Critics say they complicate it. The debate continues. Yet another controversy would prove even more explosive because it involved not just historical records, but relationships that remained hidden from many members for decades. Few topics create more discussion than polygamy. In the 19th century, some leaders of the church practiced plural marriage. Historical records show that Joseph Smith himself entered multiple marriages. Today, the church acknowledges this history. Supporters argue these marriages occurred within a religious context that believers viewed as a commandment from God. Critics question the practice and its impact. The debate becomes even more intense when discussing details that were unknown to many members for years. Former members often say this subject became a major turning point in their faith journey. Some felt the information differed from what they had previously been taught. Others struggled with the idea itself. The church eventually ended official polygamy in 1890 and later reinforced that decision. Modern members who practice polygamy can face church discipline, yet the history remains a major source of debate. For believers, it represents a difficult chapter in a larger story of faith. For critics, it raises questions about leadership and authority. And while many expected these discussions to fade with time, another issue from church history continued to generate controversy, one connected to race, equality, and changing views in modern society. For many years, block members faced restrictions within the church. Most notably, block men were not ordained to the priesthood, and certain temple ordinances were restricted. These policies remained in place until 1978. That year, church leaders announced a revelation ending the restrictions. Today, the church rejects racist explanations that were once used to justify the policy. Many members view the 1978 change as a significant moment of progress, yet questions remain. Former members often point to the restriction as evidence that leaders can make serious mistakes. Supporters respond that religious institutions throughout history have struggled with social issues and that the church has moved forward. The discussion remains emotional because it touches deeply personal experiences. For some, the policy is part of the past. For others, it remains an important part of understanding the church's history. And as these historical debates continued, a new question emerged. What if the biggest challenge wasn't history itself? What if those historical discoveries were doing to the church today? This is where the conversation shifts from history to the present. Former members frequently claim the church is losing people faster than it can replace them. They point to reports of declining activity rates in some regions. They point to younger generations becoming less religious. They point to online communities filled with former members sharing similar stories. But the picture is complicated. The church still reports millions of members worldwide. New temples continue to be announced. Missionaries continue to serve across the globe. Growth remains strong in some regions, particularly parts of Africa. So which story is correct? Some researchers argue the real issue is not membership records, it's participation. How many people actively attend? How many remain engaged long-term? How many young adults stay after reaching adulthood? These questions are difficult to answer with certainty, and both supporters and critics often point to different data. What is clear is that many former members believe something significant is changing, not through headlines, not through dramatic scandals, but through a slow shift happening family by family. And those personal stories may explain more than statistics ever could. Behind every number is a person, a family, a life. Many former members describe similar journeys. They grew up in the church, attended meetings, served missions, married in temples, raised children in the faith. Then something changed. For some, it was church history. For others, it was a policy disagreement. Some struggled with unanswered questions. Others felt their values no longer matched the institution. The pattern appears again and again: discovery, research, questioning, reevaluation, departure. Many describe the process as painful. Leaving often meant more than changing beliefs. It could affect friendships, family relationships, and community connections. Yet many who leave also say they felt compelled to follow the evidence wherever it led. At the same time, many faithful members remain deeply committed and report positive experiences within the church. This divide is one reason the debate remains so intense. Both groups often believe they are acting in good faith, and both groups believe they have compelling reasons for their position. Which brings us to the central question: is this evidence of collapse or simply evidence of change? The answer depends on who you ask. Former members often point to historical controversies, retention concerns, and declining participation in certain areas. They argue these trends suggest a long-term crisis. Some even describe it as a silent collapse. Yet supporters reject that conclusion. They point to continued growth around the world. They point to expanding humanitarian efforts. They point to temple construction and global outreach. They argue that every major religion faces challenges in the digital age. From this perspective, the church is adopting rather than collapsing. The truth may be more complicated than either side admits. Institutions can grow in some places while shrinking in others. Membership records can increase even while activity rates fluctuate. Public confidence can decline while organizational strength remains intact. The debate continues because evidence exists for multiple interpretations. What appears obvious to one group may look completely different to another. And perhaps that is why this conversation has become so important, because it is no longer just about history. It is about the future. For nearly 2 centuries, the Mormon Church has survived criticism, controversy, migration, cultural change, and public scrutiny. It has reinvented itself more than once, and today it faces a challenge unlike any before it: information. In previous generations, difficult questions could remain hidden in archives and libraries. Today, they can reach millions of people in seconds. Supporters see this as an opportunity for greater understanding. Critics see it as a force exposing uncomfortable truths. Either way, the landscape has changed. The next generation will likely encounter more information, more perspectives, and more debate than any generation before it. The question is not whether those conversations will continue. They already are. The question is where they lead. Will the church emerge stronger through transparency and adaptation? Will former member communities continue to grow? Will younger generations respond differently than those before them? No one knows for certain, but one thing is clear. The story is still being written. And somewhere tonight, another member is opening a document, reading a historical record, or asking a question for the very first time. What happens next may shape the future of the church for decades to come, and that future may look very different from what either side expects.